Hi, everyone, and welcome to News Take. My name is David Shavrin. I'm the president and CEO of the News Media Alliance. I have some great guests today. Penny Muse Abernathy and Tim Franklin are two of the leading academics looking into the marketplace for local news. And this summer, they released an update to their study on the state of local news for 2022. This study, formerly conducted at the University of North Carolina, is now a project of Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism's Local News Initiative and consists of their annual report as well as 5 additional reports to provide context for the research. By way of introduction, for folks who need no introduction, Penny Muse Abernathy is the visiting professor at Medill School. And while at Medill, Abernathy is collaborating with the school's Local News Initiative and Spiegel Research Center on local news related projects, research, and teaching. Penny is the former senior business executive with the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and the Wall Street Journal, and was the Knight Chair in Journalism and Digital Media Economics at the University of North Carolina from 2008 to 2020. Her research focuses on the implications of the digital revolution for news organizations, the information needs of communities, and the emergence of news deserts in the United States. And she's joining us today, by the way, from a farm, a beautiful farm, I'm sure, in North Carolina. Tim Franklin is the Senior Associate Dean, Professor, and John M. Mutz Chair in Local News at the Medill School, where he's leading the Local News Initiative, a research and development-based project designed to bolster the sustainability of local news in the United States, and the Medill Metro Media Lab, a project funded by the Robert R. McCormick Foundation to strengthen the local news ecosystem and journalism education in the Chicago area. Tim was appointed earlier this year by the Governor Pritzker to serve on the Illinois Local Journalism Task Force, a bipartisan group studying the local news crisis in the state and recommending potential policy solutions. Before joining Medill in 2017, Tim was the president of the Poynter Institute, a leading international school for journalists and a media think tank. Penny and Tim, welcome today. And Tim, I also have to especially thank you. I know you're feeling a little under the weather, but you really rallied to be here with us today, and I deeply appreciate this. Let's start with a pretty broad question, which is, let's just talk, how would you characterize the state of local journalism in the U.S. today? And what are some big macro trends you're looking at? So, Penny, let's start with you, and then I'll kick it over to Tim.
Well, thank you, Dave, for the introduction. And I want to, I also thank you for categorizing us as academicians. But, Tim and I bring to that long experience in the news industry. So we care very passionately about what's happening to news, and especially local news, where we both started out and spent a good portion of our careers. I think there's both good news and bad news. So let me start with the broad picture as we state in the lead to the report. We're increasingly a nation that's not only divided politically, culturally, and maybe even economically. We're also divided journalistically and to a degree digitally. And I think as we look at what the issues are we need to confront and the opportunities we have, it really is about addressing that divide. The good news is we've made a lot of progress, I think, in beginning to be aware of what the problem is, what this means for the future of democracy. But the bad news is we continue to see the same kind of trends that we've seen in terms of the loss of news. So let me just start by giving a couple of statistics, and then let me turn it over to Tim to give his added perspective on what that is. So if you look at what has occurred in terms of the loss of newspapers over the last 18 years or so, we have lost an average of 2 newspapers a week since the beginning of 2005. That is alarming on a number of accounts because in this vast country, newspapers have historically been the prime, if not the sole source for most small and independent communities. Small and mid-sized, I'd say, independent communities. So, if you lose a newspaper, you're losing the person who shows up to cover the school board meeting. You're losing the person who shows up to cover the county commissioner or even the zoning policy changes that can be quite controversial and affect the long-term quality of life of a community. So, yeah, in broad terms, we've lost more than a fourth of the newspapers we had at the beginning of 2005. And we're on track, unless we do something about it, to have lost roughly a third over the next 2 to 3 years. The good news is, I think there are a lot of things that are going on that can stem that we can discuss later, that range from policy solutions to new funding opportunities to new business development. The second thing we need to be aware of, too, is that we have lost almost 60% of the journalists we had just 15 years ago. Wow. That worked on newspapers. And so, that impacts us in two ways. That impacts the small newspapers, where you've lost the person who show up to cover the meetings, but it also impacts the regional and state newspapers we've depended on to provide the kind of big picture coverage that helps us understand how our problems and opportunities are shared by others in another part of the region or the state. So I think that, there's nothing that we can do about, operating in ignorance. We don't operate in ignorance because we now have the quantitative look of what's actually going on. So that helps guides us as to how we need to respond.
Yeah. Tim?
Well, David, first of all, thanks a lot for having Penny and I with you today. It's really a pleasure to be here. And just to follow up on what Penny said, I think what we have here is a tale of two Americas when it comes to local news. In urban areas, we're seeing some very exciting experiments going on. And while they're facing economic headwinds, like everybody in the local news industry, by and large, they're doing okay. And they're making a pivot from print to digital, and we're seeing the growth of topical digital publications, of hyperlocal publications covering neighborhoods, specialty publications that are doing particularly well. And so, there are some new models, and we can talk more about this, that are really developing and growing in urban areas and in some suburban areas. But what we're also seeing, especially in less populated rural areas, and in some exurban areas, it's very concerning. Those are areas that don't have the scale that may be necessary to grow reader revenue in this new business model era that we're living in. They don't have a base of philanthropic support that exists in some urban areas. So what keeps me up at night, and what I really worry about, especially, are the smaller communities and some of the exurban communities in America and what's happening there.
Well, yeah, so many interesting things in that, and we definitely want to talk about sort of some of the new models that are emerging. One thing I want to note, and I want to thank you for, Penny, is the reference to your mutual backgrounds on the business side and really now the research side. One of the challenges we've all faced in this moment is there's always a lot of attention to editorial. People interested in journalism want to talk about journalism, interested in that for a whole bunch of natural reasons. And also, the news business used to be a wildly lucrative and pretty boring business for a long time. And now it's kind of neither of those things. It's not as wildly lucrative as it used to be, but it's also not boring, right? The business model experimentation that's going on is, I think, extraordinary. And thinking about the evolutions of sort of when everything's been put on the table from a business perspective, getting a real focus on that is, I think, kind of new. There's a lot of people who aren't used to that, but I think that is a really rich area for certainly your research, but for a lot of discussion. So we're going to get to some new business models, but let's sort of segue in, keying off what Tim described. Penny, in particular, you've tracked quote unquote news deserts for some period of time, and talk a little bit about what that is. How is that different than the situation these communities may have faced 15 or 20 years ago? And then what happens to a community when it loses a local publisher? And then let's start with you, and then I may ask Tim for some comment after that. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I mean, you've asked me to define a news desert. I'm more than happy to give you my own personal definition of
Yeah.
that, and there are many definitions for that. My own definition has evolved over the years, and what I say now is a news desert is a community where residents have a real lack of access, and I want to put the
Mhm.
emphasis on access to credible and comprehensive local news and information that will inform the decisions they make about everyday life, as well as the decisions they make that will affect future generations. Right. So, it is what we depend on a good, strong local news organization, which, as I mentioned earlier, has historically been a newspaper in small and mid-sized communities, is for it both to bring together the fundamentals of democracy, inform us about what's going on locally as well as what's going on nationally, and also to kind of create a sense of community. So there's been a lot of research in recent years, thank heavens, by many scholars across many disciplines, whether it's political science, history, economics, and the like. And they've shown that when a community loses a newspaper, it is vulnerable in a number of ways. One, voter participation tends to go down, especially in off-year elections, because people don't know who's running for office.
Right.
Secondly, corruption tends to go up, both in government as well as in small business, because nobody's providing the kind of transparency that was there before. And it doesn't have to be big corruption, but in the end, we all end up paying more in taxes uh, as a result of even minor corruption. And as a result, too, there have been economic studies that have shown that as taxpayers, even if we don't have corruption, we end up paying more because lenders are very skeptical of places that don't have at least the oversight or the transparency that a local reporter provides by showing up for a local meeting. So, I mean, I think we should be concerned, as Tim says, we have problems in rural areas. I tend to look at it as a slightly different way, and it's based on the business model. We had a business model that was basically a for-profit business model that sustained us for almost 200 years.
Mhm.
And what has happened is we've had collapse of that business model through advertising and through reader revenue. And as a result, the places we tend to see news deserts growing tend to be economically struggling news communities, whether they're rural, whether they're ex-urban, whether they're suburban, or even inner city neighborhoods that get overlooked.
Yeah, Tim,
And,
thoughts?
yeah, I have a lot of them. And just to follow up
Great.
on what Penny is saying, one of the things that really concerns me, David, is what comes behind a news desert. What comes in behind it? And I think actually that we at Medill probably ought to be doing more research on this front. But there's some things that we know. So we know that Facebook groups emerge in these communities. That's great. Community involvement, people being engaged in what's happening in their community. But as we know, even as well-intentioned as those good people can be, that's not the same as vetted, reported local news and local journalism. And so what happens is you have, the in some cases unintentional spread of misinformation in those communities, and especially at a time when our democracy is already uh, um, facing challenges, and at a time when we're coming out of a pandemic, we know the need for accurate, credible, reliable local news and information. And then there also are more cynical things that are happening and beginning to happen in these news desert communities. So we're seeing political action committees, partisan ideologues who are creating basically fake local news sites. And the New York Times has chronicled this, and other news organizations. And we're now talking about hundreds and hundreds of communities, many of them in news deserts. Um, and so they're intermingling some local news with what are really partisan messages, and they're not transparent about it. So if you're a citizen, you can't tell what's real and what isn't. And if you think that, the Pew Research shows that about half of Americans consume news through social media. And when you get into your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed or your Twitter feed, it's hard to tell the difference between the New York Times and a pink slime site. just from looking at them.
Oh, yeah.
So that's concerning. And we're also now seeing corporations taking advantage of local news deserts to create news outlets to basically spread their own messaging. And so the Guardian and Gizmodo just published pieces about the Permian oil basin in Texas, which is one of the largest, most vast news deserts, I think, Penny, in the country. They're in Texas. I think Texas has something like 27 news desert counties. And so Chevron has created a news site, um, and it does indeed have some stories that look like local news. But when you get into it, they're really it's like a public relations vessel for the company and what is an oil producing part of the country. And so I think we're only going to be seeing more of that, of sort of, opportunists coming into news desert communities to create these things in a way to get their message out that, as Penny wrote in the report, contributes to the malignant spread of disinformation and misinformation. And so it's really, there are all the things Penny mentioned with research about civic participation and government spending going up, government borrowing costs going up, but there's also a tearing of the social fabric.
Yep.
In communities that's happening.
I think that's really underappreciated by a lot of people, that, misinformation, I think, is going to become even more, it's going to be primarily a local phenomenon, right? At a national level, there are active debates among different voices, right? And there's a lot of misinformation, but there's also a lot of counter misinformation at the national level. Locally, as you both described, you may well only have a single driver of a narrative that doesn't get checked, and that can absolutely tear apart communities. And then, frankly, also has national impact. That affects the local congressperson who, you're seeing these sort of swamp effect of misinformation seeping into not just a community, but in surrounding communities, and then into national effects that I think is deeply concerning, right? We just can't have a information ecosystem like that. So let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing. Let's be optimistic for a couple minutes here. There are obviously a lot of startups and new entrants into the local news space. If I look at the industry, the companies I represent, yes, a lot of legacy news publishers, but also digital only publishers. I represent magazines now, a whole range of voices who are basically in the digital content business, and they also have a legacy print business that's still very important, but they're trying to build a sustainable digital content business looking forward. So there are a lot of experiments around the country, a lot of them very small and in underserved areas. What are you seeing that excites you, gives you some optimism, and also what are some limits in terms of the strategy of we're just going to plant a lot of digital startups everywhere and everything will be okay? Any thoughts from either of you? Tim, we can start with you this time in terms of the sort of the startup ecosystem.
Sure. No, I'm happy to take that. We have in the report digital news organizations, and we found that basically about the same number disappear as start up in the country. And that's not unusual for any industry. Startups don't make it. But I think there are some exciting new startups that give me hope about the future. At the Local News Initiative, we just did a webinar called New in News a few weeks ago. And we highlighted a couple of these. And I'll give you a couple of specific examples, if that's okay, of things that I think are working. So take the Shawnee Mission Post, about a 10-year-old digital startup in suburban Kansas City. And Jay Center, who's the publisher there, and his wife, about 10 years ago or so, saw the Kansas City Star pulling back in Johnson County and said, hey, maybe we can fill this local news void with a digital startup. And they've done a number of very smart things. But first of all, they're in a county that's pretty affluent. It's one of the more affluent counties in the country, household income, college education levels above the national average. But in the span of 10 years, they have gone from a stop-start to a $700,000 a year revenue base with 10 staff members, largely through a digital subscription business model. They do have advertising, and that's about 30% of their revenue, but about 70% is digital subscriptions. And they also have a very smart kind of audience first, reader first focus with their coverage. They're intensely and deliberately local in their news coverage, and they have just taken off. And they're projected to be at $1 million in revenue. I think it's by the end of next year. They're continuing to grow staff. I think that's an example of being able to seize an opportunity in a metropolitan area where there's a need for news and where you can grow a reader revenue digital subscription model. There's also another example in a less affluent, more blue collar area that I think is really interesting, and that's the Richland Source, which is in north central Ohio. Again, it's also I call it a digital startup. It's 10, 11 years old. And it's an area where household income and college education levels are below the national average. Not a densely populated area. It's kind of between Columbus and Cleveland and Toledo in that little triangle of Ohio. But they have figured out how to do a diversified business model that does include members. I think that's about 17% of their revenue, but it also includes advertising. They created an in-house marketing agency inside the local news organization to serve businesses that are in that area. And they've also done some other kind of smart things, I think, in diversifying their revenue stream. But editorially, they're also focused on solutions journalism. They said they have competitors, a Gannett competitor included in that market. So they said to themselves, how are we going to distinguish ourselves and differentiate? And they've done it by this approach of, we're going to, try to find solutions to some of the most vexing problems in our community and be very focused on that approach to journalism. And it's really resonating. So I think there's a lesson there in revenue diversification, in knowing your audience, and in finding a niche that is public service journalism, but maybe with a little bit different twist to it. Yeah. Those I think are, and there are other examples. I could mention there's Block Club Chicago here in Chicago, which is growing like crazy, doing hyper local journalism in underrepresented and underserved neighborhoods in the city, also with a mix of subscription revenue, philanthropic support. They do events. They sell tchotchkes, T-shirts, and the rest from their store. Coffee mugs, but they're not even 5 years old, David, and they're already they become a force in the local news ecosystem in Chicago. So all of those things, I think, really provide some promise.
David, let me just pick up on what Tim was saying. Having done this now since 2016, you begin to see 2 or 3 markers that kind of determine whether an organization is going to be able to survive, right? And I think the 3 most critical are, as Tim mentioned, first, market demographics, right? But ownership, and I'll explain that in a minute, ownership and available capital can overcome market demographics. So how does ownership do that? Well, you need an owner who at least who is creative but disciplined, who can come up with a diversified revenue strategy, but also is attuned to the local market needs and expectations. So solutions journalism is a classic example of saying this is what this community needs. Uh, so, regardless of whether you're owned by a corporation or whether you're an individual owner, if you have the ability to respond to local needs and expectations, and I say needs and expectations of both residences and businesses, because you're going to need both, especially in small and mid-sized communities, and you will also need available capital. So, if you've got the capital first to invest, then the investment yields other things, but you need capital because we're changing so fast that'll allow you to kind of come up with give you 5-year runway to kind of come up with experimentation. So for me, when I look at things, I look to see if you've got a creative and disciplined owner, regardless of whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit enterprise, do they have the capital that they need to not only make it through the next 2 or 3 years, but to actually do the investment in the business strategy as well as the journalism to succeed for at least 5 years. So I think that is a real issue that we really need to focus on as we look for solutions is how do we get capital to those organizations that because of market demographics or because of some kind of other structure don't have the available capital that's needed to grow and become sustainable.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, a couple things immediately spring to mind. First of all, Tim, picking up on your comments, we have talked kind of rationally about rural areas that are underserved and have news deserts, and then there are obviously communities, many in urban areas, that have always felt underserved by the local. They may have had a local publisher, did not feel well served by them. And that were news deserts, pre-existing in their own right, or had real limitations, right. and being able to take some of this innovation and help to figure out ways to address what is really a long-standing problem, I think, is also extremely compelling. And figuring out how to find the capital and then appropriately invest it in this moment of really intense experimentation. And that's sort of the exciting part and also the intimidating part, because I don't know anybody who's like, oh, you do these 3 things and it's going to be fine. It's super innovative space at the moment. And so let's talk about that, about product. Because I personally think that innovation in product is going to be a big part of the future of the industry. I think we're kind of only in mid bounce in terms of understanding how we're going to be creating journalism and delivering it to people. Now we've got a traditional product, print, that still pays a huge number of bills and that a lot of people really like and will be a part of our mix for a long time. But then, broadly, how do you see product innovation in the industry? What did you see that excites you? And it could be something about somebody who's extending the runway on print and or found new ways to deliver news content through messaging or through other things that really excite you about new ways to talk to the community. And Penny, I can start with you, or if any thoughts you might have on that would be really welcome.
Well, let me just say, I can, as Tim said, I can look at lots of examples everywhere of places where people have said, okay, we're going to extend print, right? We extend print by not just being a newspaper, publishing a newspaper, but publishing magazines, right? Magazines that have a different focus, by getting outside of our market, by extending the reach outside of our geographic market. We see innovation being done with video, both in terms of offering video to advertisers as well as the kind of video segments that many papers are doing. We're seeing it with the newsletters. We're seeing it in other areas with text and messaging. One of the surveys I'm really excited about right now is one being done by Carolina Public Press, which is a not-for-profit in the mountains of North Carolina that now covers the entire state. And one of the things they're very concerned about is the lack of digital access in many communities in North Carolina. You think of North Carolina, you think of the Raleigh-Durham area, you think of Charlotte. In fact, about 50 counties of the 100 qualify as rural here. And in both far eastern North Carolina as far western, there's a real lack of digital access. As I mentioned, I'm joining you from a farm and do not have access to broadband internet right here. So you have to come up with solutions that you can either afford to do, or you rely on your cell phone. So, one of the things they want to do is find out how people are actually getting news that they use, and how do they prefer to get it, right? Is it through messaging? Is it through social media? And so I think that begins to open up a notion of how do we really respond to that. It also puts an onus on us as newspaper executives to think carefully about what communities we're reaching and how we reach them. Because for many communities that do not have broadband access, the newspaper, the print edition may be the best way to get things there. So I think the solution is going to be different in every community. I mean, I'm fond of saying there's not going to be one business model, but many, and it's going to be dependent on the needs and expectations of that community. Tim, you want to?
Yeah, yes. So what excites me, David, are the innovations that are happening in news distribution and in local news distribution. So at the local news initiative, we have a new tool called the Medill Subscriber Engagement Index. And it's made available for free to local news organizations through a gift from Google. But we have 104 local news organizations now that are in this index, and we have all of their subscriber and reader behavior, and news organizations can go in and see their own performance and then measure it and benchmark it against their peers across the country. And what we've discovered is the single most important thing for a local news organization is not page views, it's not time spent, but it's building a habit with people in their community, making it part of their daily routine to consume your news and information. So what are the best ways to do that, to build that habit, which builds customer lifetime value and long-term sustainability for the news organization? And probably the most effective tool that we have right now are email newsletters. It's the old-fashioned email newsletter. It's like it's the new home delivery of the digital era. It's like a friend that you invite into your inbox that you can then quickly read. And unlike the internet, you can actually begin a newsletter and finish it without feeling like you're missing something. But it's a way to build engagement and to build that habit, that daily habit with people every day. And the great thing about newsletters is they're monetizable. So you can include advertising, you can link people back to your site for subscriptions. There are all sorts of ways to get people engaged from that newsletter experience. And we're seeing an explosion of that. So that's one way. We're also seeing, Penny mentioned text messaging being used. So recently at the Local News Initiative, we highlighted Outlier Media in Detroit, which bought text message phone lists from people in their community and reached out to them and said, what issues do you care about and what should we be covering? And what should we be reporting? And my first thought was, oh my gosh, did you tick off these people? You're texting them in the middle of their day. But instead, they appreciated the question, and it created this conversation with the community. And they're now doing public service, enterprise, investigative journalism through text messaging in Detroit. And they've built a really solid audience in the process of doing that. And I don't know if that works in every market, but I think it's an interesting experiment and may have some promise for the future. And then at the risk of sounding parochial, I also, one of the most interesting experiments I think right now in metro news in the country is in Chicago, where Chicago Public Media in late January acquired the Chicago Sun-Times. The scrappy, venerable tabloid daily here in Chicago, which has been struggling mightily financially for many years. So they bought it, they converted it into a nonprofit. They're now in the process of hiring 60 plus new staffers for the newsrooms of the NPR affiliate WBEZ and the Sun-Times. Those two organizations have reached very different audiences. BEZ, more of an upscale, North Shore, North Side, affluent, highly educated audience. The Sun-Times does extremely well in the more blue collar parts of the city and on the south and west sides. So it's an opportunity for each of them to extend their audience bases, but it's also an opportunity for them to do multimedia and audio journalism in ways that they haven't been able to in the past. And it makes me wonder whether this could be a model that could work in other cities and in other locations where public broadcasting, whether it's public television or public radio, and a legacy newspaper, I don't know that they need to merge necessarily, but at least have extensive collaboration to the mutual benefit of each. So I think that's a really interesting experiment that's happening now. I was talking to the CEO at Chicago Public Media, Matt Moog, who's been getting inundated with phone calls from publishers and public radio executives across the country to ask about how this works and is it working and what the business model is. So I think that's a really interesting kind of newish experiment too.
David, I think Tim prompted two more things. I'm really excited about the collaboration that I'm seeing that is emerging, even if it's not a formal one, but, including the Colorado collaboration, where you've got news organizations, both for-profit, nonprofit, and public, coming together to say, what are the issues that aren't being covered? How do we work together to cover those issues going forward? And then the second thing I'm encouraged by is the influx that we've seen of nonprofit money into news organizations. I'm intrigued by many of the models. I love the local, the National Trust for Local News, and the whole notion of thinking, how do you pull news organizations in very economically challenged communities together around a hub? How do you begin to kind of fix in place a network that allows you to provide the news that maybe you can't economically support with a for-profit model? Is there a way to do it with a nonprofit model? So I think there's a very interesting innovation going on in the whole notion of how do you collaborate in the for-profit, nonprofit spectrum on journalism, but also how do you collaborate on supporting in both a for-profit and nonprofit way.
Lost you just a little bit there right at the end, but I think that's a key point. Essentially, getting a lot of people together to solve this, what is now a kind of Rubik's Cube kind of problem, but that also makes it a kind of interesting problem. I have to say a couple things pieces I'm excited about is when you look at the print product in particular, I'm hearing more and more people thinking about it as integrated with their other offerings, right? So people are used to thinking of, I have a web reader, I have an e-reader, I have a text reader and a print reader, and thinking initially that those were different people. In reality, people tend to touch on many parts of that journey. And then the question is, how do you optimize each piece to where you get breaking news up here, you get a different solution here, and then maybe you have a print product that is more review or contemplative? Like, how do you think about an integrated stack for readers? I think is super important. And again, Tim, to your point, I've been talking for years about what I call format convergence, which is we're all going to be living off this thing, this cell phone, and in which people will consume text and video and audio as I do. And who's going to be creating you create the journalism, and then you figure out a lot of different ways to tell the story, and who's going to be really first at the bend at being good at multi-format journalism. I just want to touch briefly, this has been an amazing conversation. I want to touch briefly on public policy. Obviously, we have been supporting a couple pieces of legislation. There's the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act that would allow news publishers to band together to collectively negotiate with the platforms. That's currently in legislative markup. We're kind of at the heat at the moment of that right now. We also supported the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, which would provide tax credits for local news outlets. What do you think the role? You can or cannot, whatever you'd like, comment on those or other specific pieces of legislation. What do you think the role of public policy is here in terms of addressing the local news challenges?
I think that, what we have to acknowledge is that there are going to be for-profit solutions, there are going to be nonprofit solutions, and in some places, they're not going to be either for-profit or nonprofit solutions. And so it's real important, I think, and that's one of the reasons Tim and I are very excited about taking the research that we're doing at Medill, enhancing it so that it can become much more diagnostic. Where are there the real gaps in local news? And then how do you go about supporting that? How do you work the system in order to support that? One of the things I hear from journalists is, oh, we can't take public funding. In fact, as you know, David, and have mentioned many times, there have been public subsidies for journalism since the beginning of this country. So, I mean, the key is getting that government support in such a way that it doesn't dictate what we can cover, and we keep that wall there. One of the nice things about the Local Journalism Sustainability Act is it was a tax credit that actually supported the hiring of reporters. Mm-hmm. Right. So it was a tax credit. It's an indirect benefit to the community, and it went directly into improving journalism and in that area. So I think that, going forward with policy, both at the national level as well as at the state level, and we've seen some recent movement at the state level where I'd say between 6 and 10 states are considering either policies or legislation that would help support news organizations. I think that we need to look really carefully at where those areas are that are not getting the kind of coverage they need, so that the citizens are divorced from this democracy as well as isolated in our society. And how do we go about getting that news and information and supporting the free flow of news information? And I think either policies that are directly aimed at helping journalists or policies that are helping struggling businesses such as newspapers in those economically struggling communities are going to be really important.
Yeah, look, here's the bottom line, I think, David. And I hear well-intentioned people say, well, philanthropic foundations will be the solution. Nonprofit journalism will be the solution. The reality is there are not enough philanthropic dollars to go around to support local news across the United States. There just isn't enough money to do that. So if there's not a public policy solution, David, we're looking at 1/3 of all the newspapers in America having disappeared in the next 3 to 4 years. I mean, this is a serious problem for democracy, and it made me queasy for decades to think about government intervention in journalism. I fully admit that, but we're now at a point where if government doesn't act, this spread of misinformation and disinformation that we were talking about, the disconnection of communities from each other, is only going to get worse and worse and worse. So I think, as Penny was saying, there are ways that this can be structured so that news organizations can remain independent while still getting some help. And if you look in Europe or in other parts of the world, this is already happening. Where government support is being provided to help support local news because they recognize the importance of local news in those communities. So, I mean, the Competition and Preservation Act, which I know you've been working on diligently, I mean, that would be potentially transformative if that were to pass, and significantly would provide real structural change in the relationship between news organizations and tech platforms. In a way that I think many people think needs to happen. The Journalism Sustainability Act, I view as more of a bridge to help get us through these next 3, 4, 5 years while we're trying to transition to a digital business model. Still important. Lord knows whether any of this is going to get through Congress. I had high hopes for the Competition and Preservation Act, and then that ended up getting at least temporarily shelved in committee recently.
Only temporarily, I got to tell you.
Only temporarily, right?
We're working it very hard, so
that's great. That's great.
It's not done yet.
We're behind you, cheering that on. And the Sustainability Act, I think, unfortunately, appears buried in the Senate at this point. It was part of President Biden's Build Back Better initiative, which passed the House and is stuck in the Senate. Interestingly, as Penny was saying, I think the action may be in the states. California just passed a $25 million appropriation to help support local news outlets in the state of California. New Jersey provides taxpayer grants for local news organizations in the state of New Jersey. Wisconsin is considering tax credits as well for local news organizations there. And as you mentioned in the intro, that Illinois has now formed a local journalism task force to look at policy solutions here in the state. So we may see state action on this even before Congress gets its act together.
That's great. Well, listen, I'm going to end with one final question, but I always do, and I say this legitimately, come back to a point of optimism. And my point of optimism is we have more readers than we've ever had at every demographic. So we don't have an audience problem. Let's just put it that way. And secondly, the need for quality journalism hasn't been clear, at least in our lifetimes, right? I think we, as a society, took it for granted for a while, what it meant to have good information. And now I think people are understanding what happens if you don't. But with that, listen, you talked to a lot of folks either trying to help solve the problem or want to do that digital startup one, or they're working a way to create voices in particularly underserved areas. What's one piece of advice right off the top that you give to somebody who either is trying to build something new or wants to go build something new to help solve this problem? And I'll go to anybody who thinks of it first.
Well, the first thing I would say is you have to change. That the status quo doesn't work in this environment, and so I also think it's critical that you understand your community and your audience so that you can build this reader first, audience first approach to strategy. Don't just come up with a strategy. Really try to figure out what it is your community needs and what they're telling you before you go about that. Don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to experiment. Do A/B testing. Try things. Diversify. As Penny was saying before, there are examples of local newspapers that have diversified through buying bookstores or creating lifestyle magazines or other content verticals that can support them. And think about, as you were saying, the integration of platforms and how you're going to be relevant on smartphones and on desktops going forward, which is where people, we all know, are going to be consuming most of their news. So, you got to experiment. You got to try stuff.
Yeah, I would just add that as a journalist, I tend to be a tad more philosophical about this. And to me, local news is important because it really nurtures our democracy and it builds a sense of community. So I think in anything that someone wants to do in starting a news organization or in transforming a news organization, you start by saying, how am I going to nurture democracy or nurture community? Because in doing so, you're going to end up engaging people, both readers, businesses, and everyone in the process of what you're doing. And I mean, that can move mountains in communities that on the surface might not look like it could support a news organization, but it can. And I think the other thing that gives me optimism, I would say, think of all the various ways that you can get the capital you need to support that, because the good news between now and 5 years ago is there are a lot of options out there.
Fantastic. Listen, I want to thank you both very much. This was an incredible conversation, but also I want to thank you for what you do. You're out there trying to solve a very hard but really, really important problem. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for being here today, for devoting the time, and for doing it from farms and from doing it while you're not feeling well. I deeply appreciate it, and thank you. And we'd love to have you again in the future.
But thank you.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be with you.